Dear students, I hope everyone is doing well. I am Asma Kamran. Today we are going to start a new chapter, Digestion, which is chapter number 11 in your book. We will learn about alimentary canal, structure and function and different components, oral cavity, structure and function of oral cavity, pharynx, swallowing, peristalsis, esophagus, structure and function of stomach, and secretion of gastric juice. What is digestion? Digestion is the breakdown of large food molecules into smaller molecules so that they can be absorbed by the cell. We know that food is necessary to sustain life. Food is utilized at the cellular level, but most of the food we eat is not suitable for the cellular digestion until it is mechanically and chemically converted into the form that can be absorbed by the cell, because the food we eat is in the form of large food molecules. It should be converted into smaller molecules so that cell can absorb it and then utilize it. Now the digestive system of man. It is divided into two parts: gastrointestinal tract or digestive tract, that consists of oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and accessory digestive organs which help in digestion: teeth, tongue, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. This is a figure that shows the human digestive system. Human digestive system starts from oral cavity, open into pharynx, then leads into esophagus, then into stomach, then small intestine, large intestine, which opens to outside by anus. And the accessory organs are salivary glands, tongue, teeth, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas that help in digestion. Now the alimentary canal, it is a continuous tube that extends from mouth up to the anus, and throughout its length at various points it has specific regions which are designed to carry out a different or a specific role. For example, its stomach, small intestine, large intestine, although these are the parts of this alimentary canal, but each and every one have a specific role. Alimentary canal is approximately 9 meters 30 feet long, and it passes through the thoracic cavity and enters the abdominal cavity at the level of diaphragm or near the diaphragm. Esophagus passes through the thoracic cavity and then it enters the abdominal cavity and then leads to stomach near the diaphragm. The wall of the alimentary canal consists of 4 layers or tunic. Outermost is serosa, it is also known as visceral peritoneum. Number 2 is muscularis or muscular. Number 3 is submucosa, and the innermost is mucosa. As you can see in this figure, this is a transverse section of the digestive tract. The outermost is serosa or visceral peritoneum. Next is muscular. Here muscular layer consists of 2 layers of muscles: outer layer of longitudinal muscle and inner layer of circular muscle. But in the case of stomach, there is another layer, or there is a third layer, that is of oblique muscles. These muscles are named according to their arrangement. Then inside the muscular layer is a submucosa layer, and the innermost is mucosa layer. This mucosa layer lines the lumen of the digestive tract. Now the oral cavity. The mouth is surrounded by lips, cheeks, tongue, palate, and Oral cavity is the chamber between the palate and tongue that is called oral cavity. As you can see in this figure, this is oral cavity that is bounded by lips, have teeth, roof is palate, and on the floor is tongue. The mouth is nearly filled by tongue. Tongue consists of number of rough projections. These projections are called papillae. These are the magnified figure of papillae or projections. In the crevices of these papillae, taste buds are present. This is another figure that shows the tongue. You see, these are the papillae. These projections present on the tongue are papillae. And in the crevices of these papillae, or in the depression between the two papillae, taste buds are present. Taste buds are responsible for tasting the food. This is a magnified figure of taste bud. This is another figure of taste bud. Taste bud consists of sensory cells which are connected through nerve fiber to the brain, and these are responsible for tasting the food because they are sensitive to the food. Now the palate. The palate forms the roof of the oral cavity, and it has two parts. Anterior part is hard, so it is called hard palate, and the posterior part is soft, so it is called soft palate. As you can see in the figure, the interior part is hard, so it is called hard palate, and the posterior one is soft, so it is called soft palate. Teeth in human adult, there are 32 teeth, and they are of 4 different types. Number 1, incisors, which are chisel shape for biting. Chisel shape means they have a flat surface, as you can see in this figure. Number 2 are canine. Canine are pointed or cone shaped, and they are responsible for tearing. Number 3, premolars and molars. Premolars and molars have projections which are called cusp, and they are responsible for grinding. Their function is to grind the food into fine molecules. This is another figure that shows the teeth. These front flat one are incisors. This cone shaped is canine, and then with cusp, these are premolars and molars. Incisors are for biting the food, canine for tearing, and premolars and molars, they are responsible for grinding the food. In the mouth, there is another structure, that is salivary gland. There are 3 pairs of salivary glands in human. Parotid gland, which is present just in front of ear, sublingual gland below the tongue, and submandibular near the lower jaw. Its function is to secrete saliva, which is responsible for the chemical digestion in the oral cavity. Now the functions of the oral cavity. Oral cavity is responsible both for physical or mechanical digestion as well as chemical digestion. Mechanical or physical digestion means physical breakdown of food into small food particles so that they can be effectively acted upon by enzymes. Chemical digestion is the breakdown of large food molecules into smaller ones so that they can be absorbed in the body and utilized by the cell. Now first one is mechanical digestion or mastication. Mastication is the breakdown of food particles with the help of teeth into smaller particles. So it is the breakdown of large food particles into smaller ones. Due to this breakdown, the food particles have much larger surface area for the action of digestive enzymes. And beside mastication, cooking and thorough chewing of food also destroys the cellulose of starch and increase the efficiency of the digestive enzymes. Chemical digestion is with the help of salivary glands, as we just have seen. There are three pairs of salivary glands. These salivary glands secrete saliva. Saliva contain salivary amylase. Amylase is starch digesting enzyme which breaks the covalent bond between the glucose molecules in the starch or in other polysaccharides and produce a disaccharide, that is maltose and isomaltose. Number 2 is water and mucus. It is also a part of saliva. Mucus is for the lubrication of food and oral cavity. Number 3 is sodium bicarbonate and some other salts, but major is sodium bicarbonate. Its major function is to maintain the pH of oral cavity, that is around 6. This pH is necessary for the action of salivary amylase to break down starch or polysaccharide into disaccharide. Only 3 to 5% of total carbohydrates are digested in the oral cavity. Remaining digestion takes place in small intestine, or it is completed in small intestine. Now the pharynx, oral cavity leads into pharynx. Pharynx is divided into three parts. Number 1 is nasopharynx. It is the upper portion that is present just above the soft palate and also provides a passage for air during breathing. Number 2 is oropharynx. It is present below the nasopharynx or below the soft palate, and it is also a passageway for food as well as for air. Number 3 is laryngopharynx. It is present just inferior or just below the epiglottis up to the esophagus and larynx. This is the figure that shows the three parts of the pharynx. This blue one is nasopharynx. You see this is soft palate. It is present just above the soft palate and it is the passageway for air. Below the soft palate is oropharynx, passageway both for food as well as for air, because it communicates both with the nasal cavity as well as with the oral cavity. And this is epiglottis. The third part, laryngopharynx, is present just below the epiglottis up to esophagus and larynx. Larynx is the part of respiratory system, esophagus of digestive system. Now the swallowing, food which is masticated or mechanical breakdown and physical breakdown that takes place in the mouth. After that breakdown, this chewed and soft food, it forms a ball-like mass that is called bolus. Then bolus is pushed backward to the pharynx for swallowing. For this, tongue moves upward and backward, forcing the bolus back to the mouth cavity or oral cavity towards the pharynx. The muscles at the same time, they raise the soft palate up, and due to which the internal nostrils or internal nasal openings which are present at the back of the oral cavity, they are closed. And the pressure of the food in the pharynx stimulate the nerves in the wall of the pharynx to start the swallowing reflex, which is an involuntary action. Once the food enter in the pharynx, the swallowing is an involuntary action, so it is started. Larynx, due to this involuntary action, larynx, it moves upward and meet the epiglottis, which drops over the glottis, and at the same time the glottis, which is an opening of the larynx, is also partly closed due to the constriction of the muscles present in it, and epiglottis diverts the food towards the pharynx, so it passes or slips over the epiglottis towards the esophagus and enter into the digestive tract. This is the figure that shows swallowing. You see, this is hard palate, this one is soft palate, this green part is showing a bolus, and this is tongue. When the bolus is pushed towards the pharynx, this is due to the upward movement of the tongue, which pushes the bolus towards the pharynx. At the same time, the soft palate also raised upward and closes the internal nostrils to prevent the entry of food into the nostrils. And once the food enters into the pharynx, the reflex action starts, that is involuntary action, that is swallowing. The epiglottis drops over the larynx. Larynx also moves upward, and epiglottis drops over it. Glottis is partly closed, and bolus, it slips over the epiglottis towards the esophagus, which is present just behind the oesophagus. Now, how the food from the pharynx enter into the esophagus and then moves through the esophagus by a movement that is called peristalsis. It is the alternate contraction and relaxation of muscles that produces a wave-like movement. It is called peristalsis. Actually, peristalsis is that the circular muscles which are present in the front of the food, they relax, and the circular muscles which are present behind the food, they contract. So due to this contraction, the food is pushed forward. So it moves from one end of the esophagus or one end of the digestive tract up to the other end. And this is also due to the expansion of the tube. Once the food enters in the esophagus or in the digestive tract, it expands, and that stimulates peristalsis.
Muscles produces a wave-like movement called peristalsis.
Food from pharynx enters into esophagus. Esophagus means passageway. It extends between pharynx and the stomach. It is about 25 centimeters long, begins at the base of pharynx and descends behind the trachea in the thoracic cavity, passing through mediastinum. Mediastinum is a space between the two lungs, penetrates the diaphragm, and continues with stomach. Diaphragm is a muscular wall that divides the thoracic cavity from abdominal cavity. As you can see in this figure, this is trachea that is present just in front of esophagus, and esophagus passing through the thoracic cavity enters into the abdominal cavity, into stomach just below the diaphragm, which is a muscular wall present that divides the thoracic cavity from abdominal cavity. Now the stomach. Food from esophagus enters into stomach by a wave of contraction and relaxation called peristalsis. There is no digestion in esophagus because there are no enzyme secreting cells in this esophagus, so its purpose is just to pass the food from pharynx up to the stomach. Stomach is one of the largest and the muscular part of the digestive tract, which is present in the left superior part of abdomen below the diaphragm. It is J-shaped and highly muscular, continues anteriorly with esophagus and posteriorly with small intestine. Opening of esophagus into stomach is called cardiac opening because it is present near the heart and is surrounded by a ring of muscles called cardiac sphincter that regulates the movement of food from esophagus into stomach. The stomach is divided into different parts, and its largest part is body, which then narrows to form pyloric region. Pyloric region then continues with the small intestine by an opening that is called pyloric opening, which is also surrounded by a ring of muscles called pyloric sphincter that regulates the movement of food from stomach into small intestine. Pyloric means gatekeeper. This is a figure that shows different parts of stomach. You see that is fundus, body, and pylorus. Body is the biggest and the largest part of stomach. This is another figure of stomach in which its wall or layers of the wall of the stomach are also shown. In the stomach, the muscular layer is 3 in number, that consists of 3 layers of muscles. outer one is longitudinal, middle is circular, and the innermost is of oblique muscles. And the inner surface or inside of the stomach form these ridges. These are called ruggi. This is fundus body, and this is pylorus, which then continues with the duodenum by an opening that is called pyloric opening, which is surrounded by this ring of muscles that is called pyloric sphincter. Now the layers of wall of stomach, as we already have seen that throughout this digestive tract, the wall of digestive tract consists of 4 layers: serosa, muscularis or muscular layer, submucosa and mucosa. Same is the case in the stomach. The outermost is serosa, which is also known as visceral peritoneum. Second one is muscularis. In case of stomach, muscularis or muscular layer consists of 3 layers. Outermost is of longitudinal muscles, middle one is of circular muscles, and inner is of oblique muscles. Then third is submucosa, which is made up of connective tissue, have blood vessels, nerves, etc. And the innermost is mucosa. Mucosa is also made up of 3 layers. Outermost is muscular layer, middle is of connective tissue, and innermost is of columnar epithelial cells. Columnar epithelium cells are column-shaped or longitudinal cells which make the inner lining of the lumen of stomach or innermost layer of mucosa. As you can see in this figure, outermost is visceral peritoneum or serosa, then comes muscular layer. These are the 3 layers of muscular layer. Outermost is, or first one is longitudinal, second is circular, and the innermost is oblique. Above the muscular layer, this one is submucosa, which consists of connective tissue, blood vessels, lymph vessels, nerves, etc. And then the innermost layer is mucosa, which consists of outermost layer, again a thin layer of muscular layer, then connective tissue, and then innermost is made up of this columnar epithelium. This columnar epithelium form infoldings or tube-like structures which are called gastric glands. These gastric glands open into the lumen of the stomach by an opening that is called gastric pit, and these gastric glands have different cells which secrete a juice that is called gastric juice. Gastric juice is responsible for the digestion of food, especially the protein, because it have protein digesting enzyme in it. Now the components of the gastric glands. Gastric glands consist of 4 main types of cells: the surface mucous cells, which are present towards the surface; the epithelial cells, which are present towards the surface, they secrete mucus. Mucus lubricates the inner wall of the stomach to protect it from HCl. Then parietal cells, which are also called oxyntic cells, that secrete HCl and intrinsic factor. Chief cells and zymogen cells. Zymogen means enzyme. So these are the cells that secrete enzyme pepsinogen, which is inactive form of pepsin. Pepsinogen is converted into active form pepsin with the help of HCl. And the fourth one is endocrine cells, which are also known as enteroendocrine cells. They secrete a hormone gastrin, which is released into the blood directly, and through blood circulation it stimulates the parietal and the chief cells to secrete their secretion, that is HCl and pepsinogen. This is again the figure that shows different layers in the wall of stomach, but in this figure there is an enlarged image of a gastric gland. You can see that it have different types of cells: parietal cells, chief cells, enteroendocrine cells that secrete different components of the gastric juice. And these gastric glands open into the stomach by pits or openings, which are called gastric pits. And you see that towards the surface, these are the surface mucous cells that secrete mucus, and then in the deeper part, parietal cells, chief cells, and endocrine cells are present that secrete different components of the gastric juice.
Structure of the stomach wall. There are 4 layers. Outer serous layer is formed by the peritoneum. Muscular layer is made up of 3 layers of smooth muscle fibers, which are inner oblique, middle circular, and outer longitudinal layers. The submucous layer is formed by areolar tissue, blood vessels, lymph vessels, and the Meissner's nerve plexus. The inner mucous layer is formed by the mucus-secreting columnar epithelial cells. Gastric glands are situated here. During resting conditions, the mucosa of the stomach is thrown into many folds known as rugae. The rugae disappear when the stomach is distended after meals. Gastric pits. These are small depressions present in the inner mucous layer, and glands of the stomach open into these pits.
Now the functions of stomach. Stomach also have 2 types of digestion, mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion means physical breakdown. The bolus which comes into the stomach is further physically broken down into fine particles that is then acted upon by enzymes. That is called mechanical digestion. Stomach is a highly muscular organ, so whenever its walls contract, the contractions are produced which are called mixing waves, and these mixing waves is due to the contraction of all these 3 layers of muscles which are present in the wall of the stomach. These mixing waves are also called the churning of the stomach, and it mixes the bolus with the gastric juice and produce a thick liquid that is called chyme, or food is converted into a semi-liquid form which is now called chyme. Again, this is the gastric glands that secrete different parts of the gastric juice. These are the surface mucus cells that secrete mucus or mucin, and then mucus secreting cells are also present in the neck region of the gland. They also secrete mucus. The function of the mucus is to lubricate the inner wall of the stomach. Parietal cells, they secrete HCl and intrinsic factor. Chief cells or zymogen cells secrete pepsinogen and a very small amount of lipase, which is an fat digesting enzyme. Then enteroendocrine cells, they secrete gastric juice, which stimulates gastric gland for the secretion of gastric juice. Now the chemical digestion. Mucus, it lubricates and protects the epithelial cells from the action of HCl. Intrinsic factor is a glycoprotein, binds with vitamin B12 and make it readily absorbed in the ileum. So that ileum is a part of small intestine. HCl, its main function is to maintain the low pH in the stomach, that is 1:2. This low pH also kills the bacteria that enters into the stomach along with the food. It also inactivates the salivary amylase, so the action of amylase stops over here. Low pH or HCl also denatures the protein. That denature means destroy the structure of the protein, so that proteolytic enzymes, that is protein digesting enzymes, can easily break large protein molecules into small peptide chains, and also provides a pH for the functioning of pepsin. Pepsin requires low pH for its function. Pepsinogen is enzyme which is a part of the gastric juice. Pepsinogen is an inactive form which is converted into active form, that is pepsin, with the help of HCl that breaks the covalent bond in proteins and break large protein molecules into small peptide chains. Now the role of nervous system and gastrin on the secretion of gastric juice. Approximately 2 to 3 liters of gastric juice are produced each day. Both nerves or nervous system and hormones, they regulate the gastric secretion. Hormones that regulate gastric secretion are gastrin, which is secreted by the stomach itself, and cells of the gastrin secretion are the part of the gastric gland. Secretin, gastric inhibitory polypeptide, and cholecystokinin. All these three are secreted by lumen. When food from the stomach enters into the small intestine, into the duodenum, these three hormones are secreted. Then they stimulate or they regulate the secretion of the gastric juice from the gastric gland. The taste or smell of food and tactile sensation means when food touches the taste buds in the mouth, and even the thought of the food stimulate a part of the brain that is called medulla oblongata, and a type of peripheral nervous system, that is parasympathetic nervous system. It activates, and that nerves that innervate the stomach, they secrete a neurotransmitter that is called acetylcholine, which stimulates the gastric glands, and these nerves, through the secretion of acetylcholine, stimulate parietal cells and chief cells to produce their secretion, that is HCl, intrinsic factor, and pepsinogen. And it also stimulates the endocrine cells of the gastric gland to produce gastrin. Gastrin is then released into the blood circulation directly, and through blood circulation it then again acts on the chief cells and parietal cells to produce HCl, intrinsic factor, and pepsinogen. So this gastrin further increases the production of pepsinogen, HCl, and that is intrinsic factor. The great volume of gastric secretion is initiated due to the presence of food in the stomach, and especially the protein that are present in the food. They stimulate all this nervous system and the production of gastrin, so that the gastric gland then produce more gastric juice, and then this by the churning movement it is physically broken down into small particles, and through the secretion of the gastric juice the chemical digestion takes place. This is another figure that shows the secretion of gastric juice. Sight, smell, taste, or thought of the food stimulate the nerve that innervates the stomach to produce gastrin. Gastrin enters into the blood, and through blood circulation act on the gastric glands to secrete its secretion. When the food enters from the stomach into the duodenum, that is the first part of the small intestine, this duodenum secretes secretin and cholecystokinin and gastric inhibitory polypeptide. All these three, they enter into the blood circulation, and through blood circulation they act on gastric gland and stop the secretion of gastric juice from gastric gland. This is again another figure that shows the role of cholecystokinin, gastric inhibitory polypeptide, and secretin. When the food or acidic chyme from the stomach enters into the duodenum, the wall of the duodenum, due to the presence of acidic chyme, secretes secretin, and the lipids and carbohydrates which are present in the food or in the chyme, they stimulate the wall of the duodenum to produce cholecystokinin and gastric inhibitory polypeptide. These three hormones are released in the blood. Through blood circulation, they act on the chief cells and the parietal cells of the gastric gland to stop their secretion, and also to stop the peristaltic or that contraction of the stomach, so that digestion also stops in the stomach.
Regulation of stomach secretion is divided into three phases: cephalic, gastric, and intestinal. In the cephalic phase, the taste or smell of food, tactile sensation of food in the mouth, or thought of food, sends nervous impulses to the medulla oblongata. These impulses cause parasympathetic neurons via the vagus nerves to stimulate secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin in the stomach. The parasympathetic stimulation also results in secretion of gastrin from the lower part of the stomach. This hormone travels through the bloodstream and further stimulates hydrochloric acid and pepsin secretion in the upper and middle parts of the stomach. In the gastric phase of gastric secretion, food has entered and distended the stomach. This distension activates a parasympathetic reflex via the medulla oblongata and also has a direct stimulatory effect on the gastric glands. The result is continued secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. In the intestinal phase of gastric secretion, chyme has entered the duodenum, so gastric secretion is no longer needed. When the chyme contains lipids from the digestion of fats or contains enough hydrochloric acid to bring its pH below 2, gastric secretion is inhibited. The lipids and hydrogen ions inhibit gastric secretion by 3 simultaneous actions. First, they cause impulses to go to the medulla oblongata to decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the gastric glands. Secondly, they set up local reflexes via neurons in the wall of the gut that decrease gastric secretion. Thirdly, they cause the release of 3 local hormones which travel via the circulation to the gastric glands and inhibit their secretion.
This is all about for today's lecture. I hope whatever we have done today, it is clear to everyone. Thank you very much.